Praise the Lord, everyone. On today's episode of our conversion testimony, we'll be listening to the incredible story of Amina, a 23-year-old young woman from Saudi Arabia whose family was facing one of the darkest seasons of their lives. Her father had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, their savings were gone, and Amina had been forced to leave school to help her mother sell food on the roadside. But despite having almost nothing, Amina began secretly feeding a blind elderly man who came to their street every day. She never knew that this simple act of kindness would lead to a moment that would completely change her family's life and eventually lead them to Jesus Christ. So stay with us as we listen to Amina's powerful testimony of faith, healing, kindness, and a mysterious encounter she could never explain.
It was around 11:30 in the morning, and the street was already getting busy. Cars were passing every few seconds. People were walking between the small shops, and my mother was standing beside me, trying to serve 3 customers at once. "Amina, give him the rice first," she said. "I'm coming, Mama." I picked up the plate and handed it to the customer. My hands were covered in oil because I had been helping my mother cook since early that morning. I was tired, but I couldn't complain. We needed the money. At 23, this was my life. I had stopped going to school months earlier. My younger brother had also stopped. Neither of us wanted that, but there was no choice anymore. My father's illness had taken everything from us. The hospital bills, medicines, tests, and chemotherapy had swallowed whatever savings my parents had spent years putting together. My father had stage 4 cancer. Every time my mother returned from the hospital, I could tell from her face whether the news was good or bad. Most of the time, she didn't say much. She would just put her handbag down, sit quietly for a few minutes, and start calculating money. That morning, she had only a small amount left. I knew because I had watched her count it before we opened the food stand. We were talking about it when I noticed the old man coming down the street. I saw him almost every day. He was blind, and he always wore the same dirty, torn clothes. He carried an old walking stick and moved slowly, tapping the ground in front of him before taking each step. Sometimes people gave him coins. Sometimes they shouted at him to move away. That morning, he stopped near our food stand. "Madam," he called out to my mother, "do you have anything I can eat?" My mother looked at the food in front of her. "We are almost finished," she replied. I knew what she meant. We couldn't afford to give away food every day. I looked at the man, then looked at the pot behind me. There was still some rice and stew left. Without telling my mother, I took a small plastic container, filled it, covered it, and walked over to him. "Here," I said. His face immediately changed. "For me?" "Yes." He smiled. "May God bless you, my daughter." I didn't answer. I just turned around and went back to the stall. My mother looked at me. "Amina." "I only gave him a little, Mama." She sighed. "I know." Then she went back to serving customers. I thought that was the end of it. But the next day, the old man came again, and I gave him food again. Then he came the following day. Again, I gave him something. Sometimes I had to hide the food under a piece of cloth so my mother wouldn't worry about how much we were giving away. It wasn't because she was cruel, she was simply scared. We were already struggling to feed ourselves. But I couldn't watch that man sit there hungry. I never asked him where he lived. I never asked about his family. I didn't even know his name. To me, he was simply an old blind man who needed food. Then one afternoon, something happened that I still remember clearly. The street wasn't as crowded as usual. My mother had gone to buy some ingredients, and I was sitting alone behind the food stand. The old man came and sat down in his usual place. I prepared his food and walked over. "Here you are." He took the container from my hand. But this time, he didn't open it. He just sat there holding it. I thought maybe he wasn't feeling well. "Are you okay?" I asked. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Amina, I have been watching you." I laughed a little. "You can't see me." He smiled. "I may not have eyes that work, but I can recognize a kind heart." I didn't know what to say. Then he asked me something I wasn't prepared for. "Tell me something, my daughter. If you could ask God for anything in your life right now, what would it be?" I looked at him. For some reason, I couldn't answer immediately, because there were so many things I wanted. I wanted to go back to school. I wanted my brother to go back to school. I wanted my mother to stop worrying about money. I wanted us to have a proper home. But there was only one thing I wanted more than all of those. I sat down beside him. And for the first time, I told a stranger the truth about what was happening inside my house. By that time, the blind old man had become a familiar face on our street. I didn't know his name, where he slept, or whether he had anyone waiting for him somewhere. I only knew that almost every day, usually around the same time, he would slowly make his way toward our food stand in his worn-out clothes, holding his walking stick in one hand and feeling his way along the busy pavement with the other. At first, I only gave him food when there was something left over. But as the days passed, I started saving a small portion for him before the customers arrived. I would quietly put some rice and stew into a plastic container and keep it somewhere my mother wouldn't immediately notice. Sometimes it was only a little food, but I knew it would be enough to stop him from going hungry for a few hours. The strange thing was that I knew my own family didn't have enough either. There were evenings when my mother and I would sit at home and divide whatever food remained between ourselves, my younger brother, and my father. I knew exactly how difficult things had become. Every coin mattered because my father's cancer treatment had already taken most of what we had. Still, whenever I saw the old man sitting by the roadside with nothing to eat, I felt guilty if I had food and did nothing. He never demanded anything from me. He never complained when I couldn't give him much. He would simply sit quietly and wait. When I brought him food, he would receive it carefully and thank me before eating. Sometimes I would watch him from a distance as he ate slowly, and I wondered how someone could remain so calm while living such a difficult life. Our encounters gradually became something I looked forward to. I would notice him approaching from a distance and prepare his food before he even reached the stall. He seemed to recognize my footsteps, because whenever I came toward him, he would turn his face in my direction. There was something peaceful about those few minutes, even though my own life was filled with fear and uncertainty. I also began noticing that he was paying attention to me in ways I didn't understand. He seemed to know when I was tired. On days when I had spent the entire morning helping my mother cook, clean, and serve customers, he somehow seemed to sense that I was not myself. Sometimes I would sit behind the food stand with my head down, thinking about my father in the hospital, and I would forget that anyone was watching. The old man never asked personal questions. He didn't ask why I had stopped attending school or why I looked exhausted. He simply accepted whatever food I gave him and went about his day. That made me comfortable around him because I didn't have to explain my problems. There were days when I secretly wished someone would ask me how I was doing, but I was also afraid of answering. My family had already been carrying too much. My mother was constantly worried about money, my younger brother had lost his chance to continue school, and my father's condition seemed to get worse every time we visited the hospital. I didn't want to become another source of worry for anyone. Then one afternoon, something about the old man was different. He arrived as usual, and I prepared his food. But instead of immediately eating, he remained completely still for several moments. I remember looking at him and wondering whether he was sick. He eventually turned toward me, and although his eyes could not see me, it felt as though he was looking directly into my heart. He asked me a question that I wasn't expecting. He wanted to know what I would ask God for if I could have just one thing. That question stayed in my mind. I could have asked for money. I could have asked to return to school. I could have asked for a better life for my mother and younger brother. But none of those things were what I wanted most. There was only one answer in my heart. I wanted my father to live. At that moment, I had no idea that my answer would become the beginning of something that would completely change my family, my understanding of faith, and eventually the direction of my entire life. I had spent months pretending that I was stronger than I really was. Whenever people asked how my father was doing, I usually gave a short answer and changed the subject. I didn't want anyone to see how frightened I was. But that afternoon, sitting near the old man, I suddenly felt tired of keeping everything inside. His question had touched the one place in my heart I had been trying not to think about. I told him about my father. He had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and by then the illness had already changed our entire household. There was hardly a part of our lives that had not been affected by it. Our savings were gone. My mother had sold some of the things she valued most, and relatives had helped whenever they could. But treatment was expensive, and every hospital visit seemed to bring another bill. I told him that I had stopped going to school because my family needed me to work with my mother. My younger brother had also been forced to stop his education. It hurt me whenever I saw other young people going to school with their books while I was standing beside a roadside food stall. But I knew my family needed food and my father needed treatment more than I needed a classroom. There were nights when I would lie awake thinking about how different our lives had become. Before my father's illness, we were not wealthy, but we managed. My parents worked hard, my brother and I went to school, and we had plans for the future. Then cancer came into our home, and almost everything changed. I told the old man that I didn't need a large house or expensive clothes. I didn't even care about returning to school at that moment. All I wanted was for my father to get well. I wanted to hear him laugh again. I wanted to see him walk into our home without looking exhausted. I wanted my mother to stop crying when she thought nobody was watching. The old man listened without interrupting me. He didn't try to explain my father's illness or tell me that everything would immediately become perfect. He simply remained quiet as I talked. When I finished, he reminded me that sometimes people reach a point where they have nothing left except faith. He encouraged me to pray sincerely and to believe that God was still able to hear me, even when I couldn't understand why my family was suffering. I went home that evening carrying his words with me. I didn't suddenly understand everything, and I wasn't suddenly free from doubt. I was still a Muslim girl who had grown up with everything I had been taught about God, but something inside me had changed. For the first time in months, I began praying differently. Instead of only asking for help because I was desperate, I began asking God to show me what I was supposed to learn from everything happening to my family. The next 2 weeks passed slowly. My father continued with his treatment, and we tried to carry on with our ordinary routine. I continued helping my mother sell food, and the blind old man continued appearing on the street. I still gave him food whenever I could. Nothing about our circumstances seemed different at first. But then came the day of my father's medical appointment. We went to the hospital expecting another difficult conversation with the doctors. I remember sitting beside my mother, watching the clock and wondering how we were going to afford whatever treatment came next. My father looked tired, and none of us expected good news. Then the doctors began reviewing his latest results. The expression on their faces changed. They checked the reports again, ordered additional examinations, and began discussing the results among themselves. My mother and I could tell something unusual was happening, but we didn't yet understand what it meant. When the doctor finally came to us with the results, I felt my heart begin to pound. The words he said next were words I had never expected to hear. The cancer was no longer being detected. For several seconds, I couldn't process what I had just heard. My father, who had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, had suddenly received news that none of us had been prepared for. And the first person I thought about wasn't the doctor. It was the blind old man who had asked me what I wanted most in the world. I still remember the hospital that morning. Nothing about it felt different when we arrived. The waiting area was crowded, people were sitting quietly with their families, nurses were moving between rooms, and my mother kept looking at my father's face as though she was trying to understand how much pain he was hiding. We had come for his scheduled appointment and the next stage of his treatment, expecting the same routine we had become used to. My father had already been through so much. The chemotherapy had left him weak, and there were days when he barely had the strength to eat. My mother had prepared herself for another difficult conversation with the doctors. I had prepared myself too. In my mind, we would hear about another round of treatment, another payment, another difficult week. Instead, after reviewing his latest results, the doctor became unusually quiet. He looked at the reports several times. Another doctor was called into the room, and they began comparing the results with my father's previous scans and medical records. They ordered additional tests because they wanted to make sure there had not been a mistake. My mother and I sat there watching them. I could see the confusion on their faces. Eventually, the doctor came back to us and explained that the results were not showing the cancer they had previously been treating. The additional examinations were also failing to detect the disease. They repeated some of the tests because the doctors wanted to be certain before giving us any conclusion. When the final results came back, the doctor told us that there was no detectable cancer. I remember staring at him without saying anything. My mother started crying immediately. My father was sitting quietly, trying to understand what the doctor was telling him. I had heard the words, but my mind couldn't connect them to the reality we had been living for months. Cancer-free. Those words seemed impossible after everything we had gone through. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I just held my mother's hand and watched her tears fall onto the floor. She kept thanking God, while my father sat there with tears in his own eyes. On the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about the old man. I remembered his question. I remembered telling him that the only thing I wanted was for my father to live. I remembered the way he had listened to me without laughing at my desperation or telling me that my prayer was impossible. As soon as we got back to our neighborhood, I wanted to find him. I went toward the place where he normally sat, expecting to see him there with his walking stick and worn-out clothes, but he wasn't there. I waited. People passed by, cars came and went, and the afternoon slowly became evening. Still, there was no sign of him. I returned the next day. He didn't come. The following day, I went again. Nothing. It became strange because he had been coming almost every day for weeks. I asked a few people around the area if they knew where the blind old man had gone, but nobody seemed to know. Some remembered seeing him, but nobody knew his name or where he lived. Then, while I was asking about him one afternoon, an elderly shopkeeper nearby told me something that made me stop. He said he had seen the man around the neighborhood for years, but he had never known him to stay anywhere permanently. According to him, the old man appeared in different places, sometimes asking for food and sometimes simply sitting quietly before disappearing again. I couldn't understand it. But there was something else that disturbed me even more. When I described the man to another person who had been around the area for a long time, they told me they had not seen anyone matching that description recently. I went home confused. I kept thinking about the food I had given him. I thought about the day he asked me what I wanted most. I thought about my father's diagnosis, the 2 weeks that followed, and the unexpected results at the hospital. I didn't know what to make of any of it. I only knew that a poor blind man had entered my life when my family was at its lowest point, asked me to name the deepest desire in my heart, and then disappeared shortly after my father was declared free of the cancer that had nearly destroyed our family. For the first time, I began asking myself a question I was almost afraid to say out loud. Who had that man really been? After my father came home from the hospital, everything in our house felt different. For months, cancer had been the center of every conversation, every decision, and every worry. Suddenly, we were sitting together without discussing another hospital bill or wondering how we would pay for the next treatment. My father was still weak and needed follow-up appointments, but the doctors could no longer find the cancer they had been treating. I kept thinking about the old man. I went back to the street several times, hoping he would appear again. I even kept a small container of food aside for him, just in case, but he never returned. The place where he usually sat became strangely ordinary. People continued walking past it, cars continued passing, and customers continued coming to my mother's food stand, but the man who had become such a familiar part of my days was simply gone. I couldn't explain what had happened. I knew what the doctors had said, and I knew what I had experienced, but I didn't want to convince myself of something I couldn't prove. I was raised as a Muslim, and everything I believed about God had been shaped by my upbringing. Yet after my father's healing, I couldn't ignore the questions growing inside me. I started thinking about Jesus in a way I never had before. I remembered the words the old man had spoken about faith, prayer, and trusting God. I began searching for answers instead of pushing the questions away. I read about Jesus, his compassion for the poor, his concern for the sick, and the way he welcomed people who had been forgotten by society. The more I learned, the more unsettled I became. Eventually, I shared everything with my mother. At first, she was afraid. She reminded me of how we had been raised and how serious it was to question the beliefs we had grown up with. But then she remembered what had happened to my father. She couldn't deny that something extraordinary had happened either. My younger brother became curious too. Before long, all of us were quietly discussing Jesus together. We began reading the Bible as a family and praying differently. We weren't pretending that we suddenly understood everything. We had questions, fears, and disagreements, but we continued searching. My father was the one who surprised me most. After everything he had gone through, he told us that he didn't want to ignore what had happened. He wanted to know who Jesus really was and why our family had been given another chance. His recovery became more than just a medical story for us. It became the beginning of a spiritual journey none of us had expected. Eventually, my entire household chose to follow Christ. Looking back, I still think about that poor blind man. I thought I was the one helping him. I thought I was the one giving him food when he was hungry. I thought he was the helpless person in that relationship. But now I see things differently. Those small portions of food I secretly gave him cost me almost nothing, yet they became the beginning of a change that reached every person in my family. I had been worried that I didn't have enough to give, but somehow, every time I gave something away, I felt as though I received something much greater in return. I never saw the old man again, and I cannot prove who he was. But I know what happened after he entered my life. My father survived an illness we believed would take him from us. My family discovered a faith we had never seriously considered before, and I learned that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can lead you toward a moment that changes everything. For years, I thought I was feeding a blind beggar on the street. Now, when I remember those days, one thought always comes back to me. What if Jesus had been teaching me to recognize him in someone everyone else had chosen to ignore?